Picture a 12-year-old boy in 1820s London working 10 hours a day in a tumble-down house beside the River Thames. He spends his days covering pots of stove blacking with paper, surrounded by the constant squeaking and scuffling of rats swarming in the cellar. The boy is living entirely on his own in a rough rooming house. His father failed to pay his creditors, so his entire family, parents and siblings, has been locked away in the Marshalsea debtors' prison. The Marshalsea was a notorious London facility where individuals who could not repay their debts were incarcerated until their balances were cleared. This leaves the 12-year-old suspended between the fears of a vulnerable child and the crushing responsibilities of an adult provider, earning 6 shillings a week to help keep his family alive. Another child laborer at the factory, an older boy who showed him how to do his work, was named Bob Thagan. The traumatized 12-year-old tying labels onto blacking pots is Charles Dickens. Decades later, Dickens weaponized the grief and humiliation of those months. He took his experience as a gritty parliamentary reporter and transformed his childhood memories into a furious, serialized revenge against systemic cruelty. That revenge is his novel, Oliver Twist. His trauma forged the core tension of the story. Dickens placed a pure, innocent flesh-and-blood orphan in direct opposition to public officials and a legal system that punished the destitute simply for being poor. Dickens aimed his anger directly at the parish workhouses. These were state-run facilities meant to house the destitute, but they were intentionally run like prisons. The harsh conditions inside were mandated by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This was a piece of British legislation that centralized poor relief and drastically reduced assistance to anyone living outside a workhouse. This diagram shows the brutal arithmetic behind the law. The government believed that if poor relief was comfortable, the lower classes would evade work. So officials deliberately designed the workhouse system to supply only the absolute minimum caloric intake required for survival, maximizing discomfort to deter anyone from seeking shelter. By limiting the daily allowance to 3 meals of thin gruel, an onion twice a week, and half a roll on Sundays, the state effectively subjected growing orphans to slow starvation. In the novel, the boys become so voracious and wild with hunger that one threatens to eat the weakly child sleeping next to him. To prevent cannibalism, the boys hold a council and draw straws to decide who must beg for more food. When Oliver steps up to the copper pot and asks for more, he doesn't do it out of bravery, entitlement, or even basic appetite. He does it because he drew the short straw. He is begging to save himself and his friends from being eaten. To the well-fed gentleman running the board, a starving boy asking for an extra ounce of gruel is an assault on the social order. The immediate prediction from an official in a white waistcoat is that Oliver will swing from the gallows. Through the workhouse, Dickens exposes a twisted social logic. The system treats poverty not as a temporary misfortune, but as an unforgivable crime. And in society's eyes, the penalty for that crime is death. Oliver escapes the parish beetles, but he spills out into a maze of dirty, straggling houses and the shelterless midnight streets of London. Dickens drew on his years wandering these exact neighborhoods as a journalist. He meticulously documented the foul, frowsy dens where vice was closely packed, capturing the squalid reality of children wallowing in the gutters and adults huddled in the cold and wet. At the time, popular stories portrayed criminals as dashing highwaymen, seductive fellows cantering across moonlit heaths in crimson coats, lace, and jackboots. Dickens rejected this entirely. He forced his readers to look at the miserable reality of thieves skulking uneasily through the dirt. This brings us to Fagin. Dickens strips away any charm, describing him gliding stealthily along the walls like a loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and utter darkness. He is presented as an almost demonic figure, crawling forth by night in search of offal. Then there is Bill Sikes. Sikes is a housebreaker whose resolute criminality and blinding rage drive him to murder his own companion, Nancy. His violence is so extreme that he alienates himself completely from the human community, to the point where even his loyal dog tracks blood across the floor in distress before Sikes tries to kill the animal, too. Sikes and Fagin are terrifying, but Dickens makes it clear they are not random monsters. They are the festering, inevitable byproducts of a wealthy nation that willfully ignores its most vulnerable citizens, packing them into disease-ridden slums and leaving them to rot. Underneath the story of a boy finding his wealthy relatives is a novel entirely obsessed with mortality. From the very first chapter, the threat of the Newgate scaffold, the infamous London gallows where public executions were carried out, hangs over the characters. Oliver's birth is marked by his mother dying in the workhouse bed. From that moment, the boy is aimed by his author toward the possibility of early death. Apprentices threaten to hang him, Sykes ties imaginary knots, and Fagin reminds his gang that the gallows is an ugly fingerpost waiting at the end of their road. For Sykes, the metaphor becomes a gruesome reality. Hunted by a mob and haunted by the staring dead eyes of his victim, he attempts to lower himself from a roof with a rope. He loses his balance, falls 35 feet, and the noose snaps taut around his own neck with a terrific convulsion of his limbs. Fagin, too, faces the rope. In his final hours on trial, Dickens drops us directly into the old man's panic. Surrounded by a sea of faces demanding retribution, Fagin isolates himself by fixating on a court artist breaking a pencil point and sharpening it with a knife, a mundane human detail that highlights the exact life he is about to lose. In his prefaces, Dickens openly mocked readers of a refined and delicate nature who couldn't bear to look upon these horrors. He refused to abate one hole in a boy's coat or one scrap of dirt in a girl's hair, forcing high society to stare directly at the dregs of life without the comforting disguise of romance. Oliver Twist survives his parish progress, but the book leaves a scar. Dickens weaponized a helpless orphan's fight for a bowl of gruel to prove that the vilest evil wasn't confined to pickpockets and murderers in the dark slums. It thrived in the bright halls of power, maintained by an indifferent public that legislated cruelty into law.